Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Aquarium's Online Academy. My name is Luke, and I'm here from the Education Studio here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. As you can see, I don't look like I'm in our studio, of course, because I have a green screen behind me, which I know we're all pretty familiar with now at this point in time. And I'll be seeing all sorts of cool stuff behind me throughout this program. So we'll be looking at different exhibits. Right now we have a live feed from the aquarium's, if I remember correctly, West Coast sea nettle exhibit, which is a type of jellyfish. And we'll be looking at a whole bunch of different stuff at this program today, having to do with jellyfish and the larger group of organisms to which jellies belong, i.e. plankton. We'll be talking all about different kinds of plankton, what is a plankton, why plankton are important, and then we'll go talk a little bit about the most famous plankton, the jellies behind me. Now, during this program, just like all of our classes, if you have any questions at all, you can text us at 562-286-1838. Again, that's 562-286-1838. And Carrie is on the text line monitoring, and she'll either answer your questions via text or she'll pass them on to me where I'll answer them on the show. Also, of course, behind the camera today, we've got Allie, who will be handling all the cool stuff that we're going to be looking at. And if you are watching this after the fact, if it's post facto and the class is actually not live anymore, you can still ask us questions. You can email us at live@lbaop.org. We monitor that email account all the time. We send back answers pretty quickly. So if you got questions about anything, you can always contact us. So let's begin. We're going to be talking, like I said, about plankton and jellies today. So what are plankton? It's a good question, right? This is a word we hear thrown around a lot when we talk about the ocean. We're always hearing people say plankton this, plankton that, whales eat plankton, plankton are important in the food chain and all this. But it's kind of confusing because it sounds like sometimes we're talking about like a microscopic organism. Sometimes it sounds like we're talking about like an algae or a bacteria or something. And other times we say plankton, it sounds like we're talking about some big thing like a jellyfish. And the reason for this is that plankton is not a term that refers to any specific group of animals or even animals in general. Plankton is just a catch-all term that we use to refer to any living thing in the ocean that more or less floats freely in the water and can't really control where it goes. So we all probably know, right, that the ocean has currents. The water in the ocean is always moving in various directions. There's all sorts of different currents around the world. These are the big movements of water that carry water, say, from the north down the coast of California, or carry water across the Pacific Ocean, or up the East Coast in the Gulf Stream, right? These currents are really, really important. They move all sorts of organisms and stuff, and nutrients and heat and energy around in the ocean. But most of the animals that we're familiar with in the ocean are able to resist those currents if they want to, right? A dolphin doesn't just go wherever the ocean takes it. A dolphin can, of course, swim wherever it wants to go. Most fish can do the same thing. But there's a huge number of organisms in the ocean that have to go basically wherever the currents take them. And these are the organisms that we call plankton. If an animal is basically free-floating, whether it's microscopic, and basically every microscopic animal in the ocean is plankton, or it's big, then it qualifies as plankton. And it doesn't even have to be an animal. There's plant plankton too. Now we got our first question of the day. This is a fun one. Are jellyfish squishy? Well, yes, they are. This is our first question of the day. Are jellyfish squishy? Newsflash, my friends. Yes, they are. They are squishy. If you ever happen to touch one here at the aquarium, don't squish them though, because, well, they're squishy and they haven't got much else to work with. So your jelly's not gonna last very long if you try to test how squishy they are. But like I said, every free-floating organism in the ocean, if it can't really control too well where it goes, if a current will move it whatever way the current goes, and that means it's a plankton. And we can divide plankton up into two main groups when we talk to them. Now, these groups don't cover absolutely everything, but they cover pretty much everything that we need to talk about today, and most of what you'll need to worry about in school and things like that. So we'll cover most of them here. There's two main groups of plankton for our purposes. Ooh, here's some microscopic plankton. Now, the first of these main groups of plankton are the big things that you can see in this image here behind me. You see all these things bouncing around here? This is an image from a microscope. Some of these animals are just large enough for you to see with your eye, but if you looked at them with your regular naked eye, they'd look like a little tiny white dot floating around in the water. So these animals are really, really small. And these are what we call zooplankton. Zoo as in animal, right? As in zoological and all that. So animal plankton are one plankton group. And they can include everything from the big animal plankton, things like jellyfish, down to really, really tiny microscopic organisms like what we see here. These include things like what we call water fleas, which are these little weird ball-like things floating around that have these little legs and stuff. Also, these things with these big antennae, those things are called copepods. If you've ever seen SpongeBob SquarePants, SpongeBob's arch enemy, famously, is actually a copepod. He's got one eye, little antenna. They don't draw him exactly right in the show, but he's supposed to be a copepod. Whoa! And that real big one that just came by was some kind of worm, probably a polychaete worm, some kind. So those are one group of plankton, the animal plankton. And then there's another group of plankton, which you could see the tiny, tiny dots behind me there just a moment ago. Here's an even closer view from probably, well, a much more focused microscope. This might even be an electron microscope because these things are so small. And these are what we call phytoplankton, or basically microalgae that are floating around in the water. Phytoplankton are basically very, very simple plant-like organisms that float around in the ocean. And if you've ever looked at the ocean and seen that it looked kind of green, that's because of phytoplankton. Inside every drop of ocean water, there's plankton, right? And a lot of them, the most important ones, I guess you could say, because they're the real start of the ocean food chain, are phytoplankton. They're green because just like the more complicated plants that we encounter in our everyday lives, these phytoplankton get their energy from sunlight. So they work the same way a plant does, right? There's instead of having soil that they get nutrients out of, they get nutrients out of the water itself. And they use sunlight as the energy source to allow them to process those nutrients into energy. Now, there's all sorts of different algae that live in the ocean. Some of them are big and some of them are not plankton. For example, this is a big piece of seaweed here, right? These are called giant kelp here. This is one of the many kinds of kelp that live in the ocean. Since kelp is attached to the bottom, it's not plankton because it doesn't float around. I mean, it does float, but it doesn't just go anywhere, right? It's stuck in one place. But if you look at all these little teeny dots floating between the kelp, some of those tiny dots are living organisms, and those are plankton. So again, phytoplankton is one group of plankton. That's plankton that survive off of sunlight, that are basically very, very simple plant-like organisms. And then there are the animal plankton. And in just a moment, after I answer our next bunch of questions, we'll get into kind of what the roles those animals play are. But I got a couple of good questions here. And don't worry, we're going to get more to jellyfish in a few minutes. I can see I'm getting a lot of jellyfish questions. So one question I've got here is, how old are jellyfish? Well, if you mean how old as in how long have they been on Earth, the answer is they've been on Earth basically longer than any other animal that you can see. Jellies were probably the first kind of multi-organed animals to evolve on this planet that were larger than tiny little microscopic stuff. Also, and in terms of how long they live individually, crazy thing about jellies don't exactly age. So they can live a pretty long time as long as nothing happens to them. But we always have to remember, just because an animal doesn't age, and there are a few animals that don't, just because they don't age doesn't mean they don't have a limit on their lifespan, right? In practice, most jellies don't live super long because things like waves might tear them up eventually. They get caught in a really bad current, a really rough storm or something. They might get damaged by that. They might get eaten by a thing. Allie's doing a great job of guessing what I'm about to talk about next behind the camera there, because this is one of those things that eats jellies. This is a sea turtle, right? Sea turtles are famous for eating jellies. There's other organisms that eat them too. We'll talk a little bit later on about how things can eat jellies. And also, of course, jellies can get diseases and things, just like really any other living thing can, right? So although they don't really age, they do have a practical limit on their lifespan. But the cool thing is, though, that if they're in an aquarium where everything's perfectly safe, they can last a really long time. The sea nettles that you see in here, some of them have probably been in there for, I'd have to ask just to make sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of them have been floating around in there for a couple of years. Now, we have a lot of questions coming in this morning. This is exciting. So I'm going to move on to one more thing about plankton in general, and then we'll sort of talk more about jellies. So plankton, right, are the very, very smallest things that you can find in the ocean. All the very tiny microscopic organisms in the ocean are plankton because If you're microscopic, the fact of the matter is you're never going to be able to resist a current because you just don't have fins that are big enough to push you. You can't move fast enough to do that. You might be able to kind of control where you go in a little drop of water, but here's the thing. If you live inside a drop of water in the ocean and you're only big enough to push yourself around, just on a microscopic level, right, by the time you move, a millimeter, right, the water you're in might have moved 5 feet that way. So even if these plankton look like they're kind of pushing themselves around, in the grand scheme of things, the currents are still controlling where they go, as you can kind of see as you watch this water move behind me. Look, they might be twitching around inside the water, but as they go, the water is moving so much more than they can, or so much faster than they can. Now, why are plankton so important? Plankton, and there's that worm again, plankton are the base of the entire food chain in the ocean. The very first organisms that ever came to exist, not just in the ocean, but actually probably in the world, were almost certainly plankton. Free-floating organisms that just couldn't really control where they go, but had enough of the kind of body parts necessary to allow them to process nutrients, to reproduce, to grow. And thanks to plankton, the ocean is a very, very productive place. Because of the existence of plankton, all the other bigger organisms that we see in the ocean have a base to their food chain, right? If you're any kind of animal, you can't get your energy from sunlight because you just can't, right? I can't sit out in the sun. I might warm up if I sit in the sun, but I'm not going to be able to get food from it, right? I need some other kind of organism that's able to turn sunlight, the Earth's main energy source, into something that I can use. And it's the same thing for animals in the ocean. So if you look at any food chain in the ocean, any part of the ocean food web, let's say if you start with an animal like, say, a famous one like a great white shark. If we go down the food web from any animal in the ocean, it always eventually leads back down to plankton. So let's say we have a great white shark that likes to eat, I don't know, seals, okay? So the great white shark eats some seals. The seals, in turn, eat things mostly like fish, maybe occasionally some bottom-dwelling stuff, maybe some squid. Those things might eat some other fish and stuff like that, but actually, most of the fish that the seal's eating probably get their main diet out of plankton. So in pretty short order, the ocean food web leads right back down to plankton. And, of course, inside the plankton world, there's actually a food web there, too. Because most animal plankton make their living either by eating smaller animal plankton or by eating zooplankton. So when you really want to get down to it, the real base of the ocean food chain is not just plankton, but specifically it's phytoplankton. It's those green algae things floating around. Here's some diatoms. This is one of the really kind of interesting kinds of plankton. These are an algae that makes a little glass case that they live inside of. It really is glass. It's silica. And they float around and they have these interesting shapes because they're made out of glass. And these get eaten by all sorts of organisms and it moves on up the food chain from there. Some of the biggest animals in the ocean also eat plankton. Some things like, for example, whales. Whales eat a somewhat large type of zooplankton called krill, which we might have a picture of. I don't know if we have a picture of krill or not. Ooh, we have a krill somewhere. Well, krill, I don't think I can show you a picture of krill right now, but krill basically look like a little shrimp. They're about this big. Sometimes there's a couple different species. Some are about this big, some are about that big. But either way, they hang out by millions at once, and whales gulp them down in big masses. There's also some species of shark, like basking sharks and whale sharks, that eat plankton. But in a lot of cases, animals, things like dolphins and seals, right, might have some larger things they eat. But again, when you see what eats what, and then what eats that, and so on, eventually you always get back down to plankton. Now, to talk about plankton, though, we could literally talk all day about all the tiny microscopic plankton that people find so fascinating, and that are so important. And if you ever want to be a scientist of plankton, there is so much science left to do in the ocean. This is one of the great things about the ocean in general. There's so many animals and so many things that we don't fully understand yet that you can learn about and study. If you think everyone's been discovered, it hasn't. There's so much left to learn. But whenever we talk about plankton, though, eventually it's always most fun to talk about the most famous plankton of all, and those, of course, are the jellyfish, or the sea jellies. Now, at the aquarium, we often call them sea jellies to make it clear that they're not actually fish, right? To be a fish, you got to have a backbone, and jellies don't have that, so they're not fish. But scientists actually do call them jellyfish a lot because they can tell they're not fish. They don't worry about it. And there's a whole bunch of different kinds of jellies. Like I said, jellies first arrived, like they're not aliens. They came from here. They do look like aliens, though. Jellies first developed or evolved on Earth hundreds of millions of years ago. It's hard to find jelly fossils because they don't have bones, so they don't preserve very well. But every once in a while, the conditions are just right, and we'll find it in where a jelly might get fossilized. And so we do know that jellies have been around here on Earth for hundreds of millions of years, about 600 million, maybe a little bit more. And in that time, they've done pretty well for themselves. They've diversified into all these different shapes and sizes. The smallest jellies are microscopic. The biggest ones can sometimes be up to like 100 feet long if you count their longest tentacles. Those ones are really rare, though, thankfully. And most of them, though, are kind of in the middle size. This one behind me looks huge because it's a blown-up picture. But this is a flower hat jelly, and this jelly is about maybe that big in real life. So how do jellies work? I mentioned that like any other plankton, right, they have to just float around. So think about that for a second. If you're a jelly, how do you work? How do you get food? If you just float around, I mean, can you control where you go at all? It's a really good question. I want you to think about this for a second because I also just discovered I have another question. How are plants and algae different? That is another question I got. I remember a few minutes ago I was talking about phytoplankton, and I said they're kind of like plants, but they're not really plants, they're algae. The main difference between plants and algae is if you learn about plants in school, they'll tell you that plants have sort of complex systems inside their entire structure that allow them to have different specialized purposes. So like the roots of a plant don't process sunlight, right? The stem doesn't usually process sunlight, but the leaves do. And also, if you look inside of a plant stem, you'll see like these different they look almost like blood vessels like you would expect, except they don't move around blood. Instead, they move around water and nutrients. They're called xylem and phloem. So plants have all these complex structures like that. Algae are much simpler. Algae basically have less diversified structures. Sometimes they look like a little more diversified. The more complex algae, like this giant kelp here, looks pretty much like you would expect a plant to look. But if you actually look at them on a microscopic level, they're nowhere near as complicated. So we could go on and on about that, but that's kind of the main difference. Algae are basically like a simple form, a more primitive form of a plant. But they don't quite qualify as plants because of that, even though they do live off of sunlight. Now, where was I? Oh, yes. So the question was, how does a jelly work, right? Well, here's the thing about jellies. And I guess you could say, if you really think about it, that jellies are maybe a great example of almost the bare minimum of things that you need in order to be a functional animal. If you think about that, what do you need to be a functional animal, right? What is the absolute bare minimum? Well, every animal needs to eat because we can't make our energy from sunlight like plants can. And every animal needs some way to reproduce, some way to make more of itself, right? Jellies have both of those things. And to be totally honest, they haven't got much else. Sometimes I like to say that jellies can be thought of kind of as just a big floating like reproductive system and digestive system. Like that's pretty much what they got going on. And if one of these jellies would just sit still for me, I could point out some of these features. Let's see here. We're going to find a picture of a jelly so we can start talking about it. But first off, as I mentioned, every animal needs a way to eat. So let's start with that, because most of what you see on a jelly's body has to do with basically how it catches its food. You see, when you watch a jelly twitch and move around, good, still picture of a sea nettle here. What you'll notice is that this big part up here, this part's called the bell, twitches, right? That bell's twitching motion is more or less automatic. And it basically twitches not so much to control where the jelly goes, though it does do a little bit of that. Like I said, plankton don't have zero control over where they go. They just don't have very much and can't really resist a current. Mostly, the twitching of the bell is a way for the jelly to pump itself through the water, and as it pumps through the water, to suck some of the water up toward its tentacles. And then, as it moves through the water, keep on moving through new water, right? As it does this, as it's pumping its body along, those dangling tentacles are passing through all the water that's around it. And they are catching any little tiny microorganisms, small plankton, whether they be zooplankton or phytoplankton, that are floating around in the water. Now, the next question I got is, where does the food go? I also got the question, what do they eat and what eats them? We mentioned, by the way, that jellies have predators of their own. Turtles famously eat jellies. They have a specialized throat and mouth. The skin is too thick for a jelly to sting them. But in terms of what they eat, again, it's mostly plankton, but there actually are some jellies that are big enough to eat fish, too. It does happen from time to time. Also, their cousins, the anemones, occasionally eat fish as well. A sea anemone, which I bet we have a picture of, is basically a jelly that lives on a rock its entire life. But actually, jellies all, for the most, I think all of them, I don't know of any jellies that don't, live on rocks at some point in their lives. We'll get to that in a minute. But how they eat, again, they pump through the water, right? And the whole point of this pumping through the water is mostly to move water past their tentacles and to kind of then keep their food moving toward their mouth. So where's the mouth, right? So first off, the tentacles here are covered in stinging cells. They're microscopic stinging cells, but there's millions of them. And basically, the stinging cells of a jelly, which are called cnidocytes or nematocysts, are kind of a spring-loaded needle, which is usually venomous too. Not so venomous in most cases that it would be fatal, but venomous enough to cause a stun, to stun an animal, to be really painful, to be debilitating for an animal. For most humans, most jelly stings are luckily just itchy. If you happen to get stung by a West Coast sea nettle, it's not fun, but according to the folks who work here who've been stung by jellies, I'm lucky enough that I never have been, they say you get over it in a few hours. So if you ever get stung by a sea nettle, don't worry. You should be okay pretty quickly. But there's other jellies that you got to worry about more. So generally, stay away from jellies in the ocean if you see them. Don't go reaching out to them. But also don't panic if you get stung. So these stinging cells, right, basically grab on to anything that bumps into the tentacles with these little microscopic needles. Mostly they grab onto small stuff. Now, as the tentacles are grabbing onto things, gradually over time they also brush against these fluffy things in the middle. These fluffy things in the middle are called oral arms. And these oral arms are the second step, so to speak, in the process of eating. Because the oral arms get stuff off the tentacles, and also they catch a lot of stuff themselves. And the oral arms then, in fact, they catch a lot of stuff themselves. They have stingers too. And the oral arms grab the food and begin the process of digesting it and also moving it up toward the main digestive center of the jelly, which is underneath the bell in here. And that area is called, well, it's called the stomach, actually, or the digestive lining. It doesn't really look like a stomach. You know, a stomach, you expect some kind of like bag. But for a jelly, it's kind of all on the outside inside the bell, just like a layer of tissue inside the bell. And that digestive tissue then breaks down all that stuff, and then there's other kinds of tissue right above it that then process that eventually into more parts for the jelly, so the jelly keeps getting bigger, right? And that's basically how the digestive system of a jelly works. Catch things with the tentacles and oral arms, move them up to the stomach tissue, digest it, grow bigger jelly. And there's a couple of interesting things about jellies that allow them to have some control over what they do in their daily lives. For one thing, along all these little dimples and grooves on the edges of the bell, there's actually little sensors that the jelly has that can tell it if it's pointed up or down. They can sense light. So there's jellies that are, most jellies actually are able then to say no. If it's daytime, they tend to want to move toward the surface. If it's nighttime, they don't care so much. And in order to make those decisions, by the way, they don't have to have a brain. The sensors send cues directly to their muscles. They have one thin lining of muscle over their entire bell and tell those muscles what to do. So it's a very, very simple organism. No brain required for the operation of a jelly. Now, that's basically how jellies eat. Then there's the question of how jellies reproduce, which is the only other thing you really need to be a basic, very simple animal, right? You need to be able to eat, digest, and grow your food and all the stuff the digestive system does, and then you need to be able to reproduce. Jellies reproduce in a kind of a complicated way. When jellies want to reproduce, for the most part, there are boy and girl jellies. There's males and females. They usually have to touch. Some of them are able to release their eggs and sperm into the water. But in any case, once their eggs get fertilized, they actually float around freely for a while. And I know Allie's looking for a picture of this. We might be able to find it. The baby jelly, when it's first a little fertilized egg, a little larva, floats around freely for a while. And then eventually it settles on a rock, and it turns into this thing called a strobilia. There's actually several phases. We're not going to get into all of them right now, but you can look it up if you want to. It's fascinating. Here we go. They turn to these things called strobilia, and this is the crazy part. One little jelly egg lands on a rock, right, and turns into this weird thing that looks some kind of freaky anemone. This is actually stage 1. These are called ephyra. And once these things have gotten enough food as they're growing, they eventually turn to this strobilia thing, which is these weird things that look like a weird stack of folded up, I don't know, it looks like a lanyard or something, doesn't it? Each one of those little layers that you see there is a clone. The strobilia are themselves a little jelly factory, and they actually don't just produce one offspring, they produce a bunch. Once they get big enough, these little clone jellies get ready to pop off. Oh, I'm sorry, these things are called scyphostoma. I'm getting my jelly terms all mixed up, but don't worry, this won't be on the test. Is there a test? I hope not. All right, so these little things turn into these strobilia, and eventually these things called ephyra, excuse me, I'm trying not to sneeze here, called ephyra, here we go. Sorry, I have allergies. I'm allergic to like everything in the world. These things eventually pop up, and those are called ephyra. And when those ephyra come off, they look like a little pulsing umbrella. That's a baby jelly. And eventually, they grow into the big jelly, which is called a medusa. That's jelly reproduction. And this whole process just goes on over and over and over again. And even though the big jellies, oftentimes, because they're so big and vulnerable to turtles and stuff, don't necessarily live all that long. Like I said, they don't age, but they can still get eaten. They can get diseases. They can get hurt. These things on these rocks, these strobilia things that make the little clones, they can sometimes live for decades. Crazy, huh? And if you really think about the closest relatives of jellies, the anemones, anemones are basically a jelly that never leaves that phase where they live as a tentacle-y thing on a rock. They don't have a free-floating phase, but they're just a big baby jelly in a sense. Now, but they can still reproduce. And I know this is getting confusing, but that's the wonder of biology, right? The more we learn about animals, the more we're like, what? But that's why we keep on learning. There's no way we could explain all the cool stuff about jellies in a half an hour. And this is why it's so interesting to keep on studying. If I'm saying stuff that sounds wacky and confusing and complicated, well, it is. But guess what? Every time you learn a little bit about it, you both have something that you've learned, and you've also opened up doors to learn a whole bunch of new things. Every time I teach about this, I learn more stuff just by talking about it, because it makes me go, I just said something. I don't know if I fully understand it, so I better go learn some more. I mean, I might know enough to tell somebody a little bit about it, but I don't know enough to necessarily say I was knew everything. So I'm always learning stuff, even as I talk about these things, even though I've been doing it for a long time. Now, we have a couple minutes left. We've talked about plankton, the base of the ocean food chain, how it kind of all starts with the energy of the sun, how plankton there's phytoplankton, there's zooplankton, right? So there's algae plankton or plant-like plankton, there's animal plankton, how other animals in the ocean then feed off of those. We've also talked about how plankton can sometimes be very big, including the largest plankton, which are jellies. Now, one of the last questions we've got here, but again, we have a couple minutes left. If you have any questions, you can still text them to us. One question I got is, what are some of the biggest jellies? That is a good question. To my recollection, the largest species of jelly in the world is the lion's mane jelly. And I'm hesitant to say, because whenever I have a fact that I haven't checked in a long time, I always worry I remember it wrong. But if I remember correctly, lion's mane jellies can have tentacles that extend to be over 100 feet long. Sometimes they can have... Sometimes they have... I just got a really funny question. I'll answer it in just a second. Sometimes lion mane jellies can have a bell that's like 4 or 5 feet wide, and then the tentacles go on for a really long time. And like I said, I said some jellies can eat fish. A lion's mane jelly is an example of that. So jellies can get huge. But even so, they're still just this simple, mostly free-floating thing. Now, I have one final question. And this is a fun one and a good way to wrap up with something that will probably just provoke more questions. Somebody actually texted this into us. Do zombie jellies ever die? Do zombie jellies ever die? Well, first off, my good questioner friend, I never said they were zombies, though I guess they don't have brains and they wander around eating everything they encounter. So they're kind of like zombies in a way. Actually, they're a lot like zombies now that I think about it. So, good point. So, do they ever die? Like I said, jellies can die. They can get eaten by things. they can get a disease, they can get damaged, but they don't age. They don't show a lot of the typical signs of aging that we associate with animals. You know, they don't get gray hair, they don't get wrinkles, at least not from aging. They get wrinkles like sometimes from injuries, but they don't get them from aging. And they're also, though, because they clone themselves in part of their reproductive cycle, you could argue that they're effectively immortal. Most jellies do have a reproductive cycle that goes in one direction, by the way. So most of them, it's like the medusa has produces this eggs and sperm, which then become the fertilized eggs, which then settle on a rock. They turn into the scyphostoma, then the strobila, then the ephyra, then back into a medusa again. But crazy thing, a couple years ago, they discovered there's also jellies that can do it backwards. So if you can reproduce backwards, to my mind, that more or less makes you immortal as far as aging is concerned. If you're able to be like, you know what, I don't want to be an adult jelly anymore. And again, not all jellies do this, just a very small number of them that were recently discovered. If a jelly is able to revert back to a earlier part of its life cycle, to me, and then start cloning itself, to me that sounds like an immortal creature as far as aging goes. So again, endlessly fascinating jellies. They've been here for hundreds of millions of years. They have one of the most simple plans for how to survive that you could possibly imagine for an animal, yet it works. It works really, really well. It works so well that, in fact, as our oceans, get depleted of some of the larger things because of overfishing and stuff, many scientists expect jellies, if anything, will become more common. So unless you want an ocean that's got too many jellies in it, you better take good care of the place. So I hope everyone's enjoyed learning about jellies and plankton. And thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to see more of our online academy classes, you can see the old ones online on our YouTube channel. They're also shared every day, I believe, on our Facebook as well. And other than that, I hope you've had a good time, and I hope you'll join us next time here at the Aquarium's Online Academy. My name is Luke. See you next time. And by the way, oh yes, last thing. If any teachers are watching, we would love it if you could tell us how many students are in your class. If you just want to text us in how many students you have watching with you, that helps us to know how many viewers we've got and helps us to keep this program going and keep getting the support that we need. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye, everybody.